All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get going here. We are in chapter 12 of the story. Or if you're following along in your Bible, we're going to be in 2 Samuel for a good portion of things here. All right. Here we go. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and open prayer this morning and go from there. God of grace, we thank you for the ways you have worked throughout history. We thank you for your great story that brings about our rescue and salvation. We pray that as we turn and look to King David today and see your work in his life, that we might see your grace and your provision even for us. Bless us today as we gather around your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so last week we talked about the start of the transition between Saul and David. God had rejected King Saul. What was the deal with King Saul? Why was he rejected? Well, he rejected God, so he didn't wait on the Lord, right? So he was doing things kind of that were more fueled by his concerns for himself, his political affairs, everything there, than he was trusting in God's direction. So we hear about God choosing this young shepherd boy, who was he the oldest of his brothers? No. Where did he fall in the line of Jesse in terms of Jesse's sons? He wasn't the first. He was the baby of the family, right? So God doing this great thing, not through the firstborn, but through the youngest. So God chooses David. God sends Samuel to anoint him, and we hear of various things that happen in David's life. You can go back and take a look at that in chapter 11 of the story. But now as we're turning to chapter 12, at this point, as we hear at the end of 1 Samuel, Saul falls in battle. And what's the narrative there? What happens to bring an end to Saul's reign? He's in battle. What do you guys remember? We did talk about that one last week, didn't we? It's becoming a little bit of a blur for me. So Saul's in battle, and he's wounded. So what does he do? Well, so Saul first, he turns to his armor bearer, right? Who's like his war caddy, I guess, to tell him to do what? Kill me, because what's going to happen if the Philistines get him? Worse, right? So the armor bearer doesn't do that, right? He's like, why is the armor bearer, who's the war caddy here, why isn't he going to do that for his king? The king is God's anointed. He's the chosen one, right? So he's not going to set his hand against God's anointed one. So he doesn't do that. So Saul, right, falls on his sword. And the armor bearer, seeing this, he does the same. He's not abandoning his king. So that all happens. But then as we get into 2 Samuel, we hear about David then finding out about Saul's death, which has a few more details with it too. So that as David hears about what happened to Saul, he gets the word by somebody who's coming from the battle, who's kind of beat up, and comes to him and tells him what are the additional details? Is Saul falling on a sword, does that kill him? No, he might be. He was already mortally wounded. He falls on his sword, but apparently he's fairly resilient, and so he doesn't die. And he's in the process of dying. But this guy comes up to him, and Saul says to him, "Kill me, because I'm in agony." He's obviously dying. So this guy does what? He kills him. So he kills him, then goes to tell David, who is, for many years, Saul had been chasing after David. So kind of in some ways bearing this news. This guy takes Saul's crown. He takes his armlet, his royal signs of office, and brings them to David. And David's reaction is what? Well, one, he's not happy that Saul is dead, right? Because he's God's anointed, and so he's sad there, but he's also sad that who else died? Some of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, who's David's best friend. So Jonathan has died as well. And so he tears his clothes, he mourns, and then he's like, okay, so guy that has come to bring the crown and the armlet to me and bring this news to me, how is it you weren't afraid to strike down the Lord's anointed? And has one of his guys there, take this guy and execute him. And he does. Because he struck down the Lord's anointed. And there was a consequence. So this has happened. We have David lamenting over Saul and Jonathan. And then something's happened. They don't go through it all as we're reading through chapter 12 in the story, but if we're going to take a little bit more time this morning to kind of explore that, some things that we should see. So first, David is anointed as king of Judah. Now, Judah, remember, is the southern territories. This is before there's a split kingdom, per se, but David is operating there in the south. Saul had his capital up in the north, and the southern kingdoms rally around the southern peoples, the tribes rally around David as king. So they anoint him because Saul is dead. The nation needs a king. David is the king. And then what happens up north? Well, not all of Saul's sons died. So there's one that was left, one that was not out in the battle with the rest of them. And his name is Ishbosheth. And he's going to come up a little bit here as we're going through this. But Ishbosheth, Saul's son, he's 40 years old when he is made to be king. And he's made king up in Israel after the word comes to them that King Saul is dead. So the king is dead, long live the king, and it's Ishbosheth up in the north. So there is, for those keeping track, there are two kings now. So the north and the south, and there is certainly an incentive for Ishbosheth to get rid of David because he's, again, a threat. So like it was to his father, Ishbosheth is going to do what he can to see about getting rid of David as well. So there are conflicts between the north and the south, not quite like a large-scale civil war, but Joab is one of the guys that rises up here. He becomes a general for David, and we're going to see him a little bit later here. So there's conflict between Abner, who is the general up. He's the commander of Saul's army, so he's the commander for the north. He's supporting Ishbosheth. There's Joab, who's supporting David. They have some conflict. Abner, he realizes, well, you know what? Ishbosheth is not the guy, so I'm going to support David. So the commander of Saul's armies is going to be turning from Ishbosheth. He's going to be supporting David, and David is like, okay, I trust, because Ishbosheth was not trusting Abner, the guy who made him king. So Ishbosheth goes to David. David says, okay, we're gonna respect this. We are going to welcome Abner in as an ally, which kind of makes sense, right? So that if your enemy's general comes to say, real deal, don't like that guy, you're the one that God has put in charge. Not all of David's people are super psyched about that. So remember Joab, the David's guy? As Abner is leaving, he sends guys to go catch up with Abner and kill him. And David, he's saddened, he's upset by this, but he does not get rid of Joab. And that's going to come back to bite him. So for whatever reasons, we don't exactly know why David spares Joab, but he does kind of curse him. So he curses him, and, well, later things happen. We'll get to that in a minute. So Ishbosheth, and remember, who's Ishbosheth? Saul's son, king of Israel, so king up in the north. when he hears that his general died, because he doesn't necessarily know that he went to go hang out with David, he's all of a sudden very concerned. And so he goes to at some point goes and lies down in his tent, and he's resting. And then he has these two guys who are kind of like raiding captains for him. Maybe not the best dudes, as we see here. They come to Ishbosheth as he is kind of sleeping and resting in his tent in the middle of the day, and they stab him in the gut and then chop off his head. Not the best people you want to have working for you. But then they go and they take his head down to whom? They killed him, and they take Ishbosheth's head down to David. Be like, hey, brought a present for you. Your enemy's dead. You get to be king over everybody now. So David said, okay, you've killed a guy in his own house. Were you not at all concerned about this? So David tells, I don't know if it was the same guys as before. It's like, all right, take these guys and execute them. And they do. So the line of Saul, the ruling house of Saul, is done. Now Jonathan had a son. So David's best friend Jonathan had a son, and he was about 5 years old when Saul and Jonathan died. And as Scripture tells us that his nurse who was with him, she takes him up, flees, but in the fleeing, like falls, trips, something drops, and something happens so that his feet are crushed. So he becomes lame for the rest of his life. He has it's so hard for him to walk. His name, Mephibosheth. We'll come back to him. So the ruling house of Saul is done. David, the people get together and anoint David as king over the whole nation. So David is now king over the whole nation, and he takes this city of Jerusalem to be his capital. Jerusalem in Judah, in the south part of the kingdom. It is a fortified city, so it's a good location, high up on the hills. So whenever people talk about going up to Jerusalem, so whether they're from the south or from the north, they're physically having to go up to this city, Jerusalem. And David makes it basically his base of operations. There's kind of a fortress there, like an reinforced space, so kind of a good stronghold for him. So he has this as his base. According to Jewish tradition, and there's no reason to think this isn't the case, we look back and we see that this is also likely the place where outside of the city in David's day up to the north, it was Mount Moriah, or the place where God directed Abraham to go and sacrifice his son Isaac. So kind of it all coming back to this place. So David has he's got the kingdom now. He's king over all. He's got the city of Jerusalem. He is reinforcing this city of Jerusalem. God is blessing him, and he is continuing to expand the territory of the kingdom, defeating the enemies around them. Other kings around hear of David. They know that God is blessing him. He's doing these things, so they send supplies so that he can kind of build up his capital city. David also gets from Saul Saul's concubines and wives. Now, if you remember back when God gave instructions about how his people were supposed to work, their kings were not supposed to be acquiring a whole bunch of wives for themselves, because that's like what everybody else does. Still, that's what's happening. So David has this. He has, I think at least, let me think. I think like at least 9, maybe 11 kids, something. Yeah. So he's got a whole bunch of kids through all these different wives and concubines. David has victory over the Philistines. So things are shaping up well for the Davidic kingdom here. where's the Ark of the Covenant in all this? Do you guys remember where we last left it? No, it's off in somebody's house. And God is blessing the person, like where it's at, because they were concerned about bringing it in, because what happened with the Philistines, bad stuff, right? When they took it, what happened is they were bringing the ark along. Well, they wanted to respect it as God's throne, and so now they said, okay, well, now that we have this capital city, now we have this base of operations, the ark needs to be here. So they're going to bring the ark in. There's this procession with great rejoicing, music, dancing, all this stuff. They're bringing it in, and they're coming to this spot, and the cart that the ark is on, because the oxen are pulling it, it stumbles and starts to maybe like fall off or something like that. And one of the two guys who's there with it, kind of accompaniment, he lays his hand out to steady it, and what happens? God strikes him dead. Whoa. And David grieves, because David doesn't understand why is the Lord doing this? So if God is doing this, how am I going to bring the ark into my city? So he kind of keeps it outside for some like 3 more months, and the God blesses the place where it's at there. But then they bring it in. We hear a little bit about this in chapter 11 of the story, but David is celebrating his dance. He's wearing very simple clothing, not like regal royal robes or anything like, but just like the simple tunic, dancing before the ark, bringing it in. And Saul's daughter, remember her name? Michal, who was given to David, so David's wife. She is looking out. She's kind of, imagine her looking out, this royal woman looking out from the window, seeing the king acting like a commoner, dancing around. She despises him and lets David know that when he comes in. And we don't know whether this is God closing her womb, or whether it's some other thing, but we hear that she has no children with David to the day of her death, which means what? Saul's family has no claim to the throne. So, got that. God makes this covenant with David that he's going to bless David, that he is going to set one on the throne of David, the throne of the house of David, forever. This coming through the prophet Nathan. We're going to hear about Nathan more about him in a moment here. That God is going to bless David. David offers his gratitude to God, has many more victories, has great stuff. He appoints officials over his land, but then he thinks about this and asks. There's a servant from Saul's household. His name is Ziba, who's kind of, think of it as like a steward who was in charge of things up in the north, and asks Ziba, all right, is there anybody left from Saul's household? Not to get rid of them, but that he might show them kindness because of his best friend Jonathan's sake. It's like, well, you know what? Jonathan actually has a son. Oh, okay. He's lame, can't walk. But okay, so David brings him down to Jerusalem and says, all right, I'm going to have you basically as a member of my household. So you're going to be a son to me. You're going to eat at my table for the rest of your life. And anything that was Saul's, so the steward was kind of been running the show, right? So steward, give all that stuff over to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, so that he'll be provided for, so that he'll have an income and everything. So the steward does all these things so that God gives this kindness to Mephibosheth as a sign of his love for his best friend Jonathan, and takes care of him as his own son. And he's got a son too, a little, I think maybe an infant son, Mephibosheth, that comes as well. His name is Micah. So we have that, and there's the blessings there. There's more battles. We're going to skip through that. But now let's get to the point where maybe David is, let's say, around 50 years old. He's had victory over the other enemies around him. And we get to this point where it's, all right, it's time for the spring. The ground has dried up from the rains of the rainy season. And so now it's the time for where kings go out to war, as they say, because the conditions are favorable. So David's troops are getting ready to go out to battle, and his commanders say, okay, well, you can stay here. We'll go out and fight. David's staying at home. He's not out in front of the troops as he has been in the past. So Joab, remember Joab, his general? We've heard about, and Joab killed Abner and all that stuff. So Joab's going out with the troops, and they're laying siege to various places around them. So over on the east side of the Jordan River. So things are going there. So David, in the afternoon, goes up into the upper part of his fortress, his palace in Jerusalem. And if you see renderings of Jerusalem, I should probably have like a slide or something here, but sorry. But on the north end of David's Jerusalem was this kind of fortified structure. So it's kind of up higher than everything else already. And houses back then, they didn't have, pitched roofs or slate or things like that. They were just kind of these flat roofs, kind of additional bonus space. David goes up on the roof in the afternoon, and he looks out and he sees he sees this woman who's bathing. And as we hear, she's purifying herself from her menstrual uncleanness. And David looks at her, sees she's beautiful. He asks about her, and he asks his guys, so who is this? Imagine he's got to bring some other guys up to say, look there too. And well, that's the wife of, it's Bathsheba is her name, son of so-and-so, and wife of Uriah. And Uriah is one of David's top warriors. He's got these 30 kind of mighty men. Uriah is one of them. And David's like, And he decides that he wants to have Bathsheba for himself. So he brings her in and brings her to his house. And how much say do you suppose Bathsheba has in all of this? Probably not much. We maybe back in years past, you think, oh, well, she's like seducing the. No, she was, and we don't know if she was like up on top of her house or something like that, bathing, or if she was like, how she was kind of publicly visible. We don't know, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is, well, David is deciding to do this thing, and so he has relations with Bathsheba, and she becomes pregnant. So she gets word back to the king that this thing has happened, that she knows. And so David, with all this before him, he sends word out to his commander, to Joab. It's like, tell Uriah to come home for some R&R. Right? Sounds like a great plan. So have him come home. And so he has come home. He celebrates Uriah. Says, go down to your house, wash your feet, relax, take it easy, spend some time with your wife. But Uriah, he's a good soldier. He's one of David's top warriors, and he's like, no, I can't do that. Why can't he do that? Why wouldn't it be right for him to go and have this R&R? The rest of his guys are out in battle, right? That's not showing solidarity with them. So he decides he's gonna stay at the house, at the front of David's house, like standing guard. If he can't be out there, he'll stay with David. So all right, so that didn't work. So he's gonna have a feast, invite Uriah, stay, and I'll send you back tomorrow. And so he gets him plenty of food, gets him plenty, more importantly, of drink. He's hoping, well, he can he can lower Uriah's guard, so he goes back to spend time with his wife, but he does not. So, all right, so then the second did not work. So he writes up this letter, these commands for Joab, his general. Because you remember Joab, stand-up guy, writes this letter to go, hey, Uriah, take these orders back to top secret. Take this back to Joab. And he tells Joab what? As you're going out to battle, right, set up Uriah where the fighting is the fiercest. And then when he's fighting, when the guys have come out against you, pull back from him. Leave him alone. Don't give him any support. So what'll happen? He'll get killed. Dead by the hand of the enemy, but we know who's plotting it, right? We know who's doing this. So Uriah faithfully goes. He takes the orders to Joab. Joab sees the orders, and he's like, okay. Well, because Joab, as we see, he's looking out for himself too, and he's like, you know what? King is going to owe me. So he does what he is ordered to do. Uriah goes out. Uriah dies. Joab sends news back to David. And he tells his messengers, when you go and talk to the king, well, we're battling and we incurred losses. When the king gets upset, he said, why'd you do that? Why? That was a stupid thing to do, to go up against the city, because they got archers and things like that. Say, Uriah is also dead. All good. So Uriah's wife hears that he has died. She mourns for him. When her mourning is over, David brings her into his house to make Bathsheba his wife. And she has a son. So we have this happen. Then God sends David a message. Sends Nathan. We heard about Nathan already, the prophet coming to go and speak to the king. And we talk about this with worship today, so we're not going to spend a ton of time in it here. But basically, David is convicted of his sin, and unlike Saul, he acknowledges his guilt. He doesn't try to make excuses. He repents. He comes before God and acknowledges that, yes, he is deserving of God's punishment, and asks for God's mercy. And if you go and take a look at Psalm 51, that's this psalm of confession that David writes in response to being convicted by God through Nathan, acknowledging his sin. We use it today as a confession, acknowledgement of our sin, as seeking God's mercy. So take a look through Psalm 51 there. But the boy that is born, he becomes sick, and David intercedes. David seeks God's mercy for this child, even though Nathan has already said this boy is going to die. And David refuses to leave his side. He's not taking the comfort, not eating food, and then the boy dies. And it says on the seventh day he died. What would happen on the eighth day? He'd be circumcised. So he dies even before that. And David, because his people are like, well, David was bad when he was sick. How bad is he going to be now when his son is dead? But David gets up, he washes himself, he gets himself together and says, well, my son's dead. I can't bring him back. Someday I'll go to him. So then after that, David goes to his wife Bathsheba, comforts her. She becomes pregnant with their next son, and his name, the name that God gives him, is Jedediah, but his name's also Solomon. We'll hear about him later on too. So this child born out of grief and comfort, Solomon. Now, other things are happening here. So as we said, David has a bunch of kids, so a bunch of half brothers and sisters. One of them, so there's one of the brothers and sisters, full brother's sister is Absalom. Hear about him a little bit more too. His sister, Tamar, beautiful Tamar. One of the half brothers is Amnon, and Amnon, he falls in love with, or I should say, he falls in lust with Tamar because she's beautiful, to the point that he's sick with passion for her. And so he has a friend who gives him some advice about, okay, well, here's what you do. Pretend that you're sick so that David comes and checks on you. And when he comes and checks on you, say, is there anything I can do for you? Say, well, send my half-sister Tamar here to bake some cakes for me so that I might have some food and, recover. And so Tamar comes in, bakes the cakes and all this stuff. And Amnon's like, oh, I'm sorry, you give me the food, just feed me with these cakes that you have baked. And so when she gets near to feed him, he grabs her and forces himself on her and says, come to bed with me. She's like, no, this is wrong. This is like, and she's kind of, to her credit, she's kind of trying to do some delay tactics. Just if you asked our father the king, he would give me over to you. Not that he would. David probably would not do that, but she's kind of trying to stall for time. Amnon does not wait. He rapes her. And then what's more, after the deed is done, he hates her. Kind of hating himself is now projecting that on her, and then casts her out so that the shame is on her, and tells his servants, throw her out. So she goes back to her brother. She is broken and traumatized from everything that happened. She's tears her robe, goes back to her brother. Remember him, Absalom? And Absalom figures out what's happened. He's like, did Amnon do this to you? And he waits for his father David to do something about it. David is angry, but he does not do anything to Amnon. He does not punish him. 2 full years go by, and Amnon is out, and there's this thing where he's getting everybody together, and he has his half brother, murdered. So he plots this thing for 2 years. He's got this hate in his heart, and so he sees to it that Amnon is dead, and then Absalom flees because he knows that his dad can. There we go. Okay, so he gets his people together, and basically tries to take the kingdom. He has this conspiracy to try to take the kingdom away from his father. David flees Jerusalem. It gets to that point where then when Absalom comes into Jerusalem, and David has fled, and they're like, hey, you know what? One of Absalom's buddies gives him this counsel. He's like, so Absalom is surrounded himself with some quality people here. Is you know what you do to show that you have the claim to the city and the throne now? Because David, when he left his concubines in charge of like running the palace and running his affairs. So you know what? Set up a tent on top of the roof of the palace, and have relations with all of those concubines, so that you can show they're yours now. What did Nathan say to David back when he was convicted of his sin with Bathsheba? God gave you all these wives, God gave you all these things, and you did this in secret. But I'm going to do this thing before everybody, so that your neighbor is going to come. He's going to take your wives away. He's going to have them in the full sight of the sun. Bam. David's own son does this thing. So does David have trials? Yeah. There's this. So that all this has happened. David is able to mount a comeback and kind of rally. Absalom and his troops go out, and they, because of kind of how God arranges things here and the timing of it, they go to battle, and there's this forest that we hear hinders the battle for Absalom's men. It says the forest claimed more men than than David's troops, like the rough conditions and things like that. But so Absalom is riding along on his mule, which is a thing that kind of points to like him taking the throne of his father David, and he's going along. And as far as we know, Absalom has these long, luscious locks, beautiful hair. And he's riding along. It gets caught up in a tree. And it gets stuck in the branches of the tree. The mule keeps going along, and Absalom is left hanging by his hair in this tree, which I think was an oak tree or something like that, but goes to the cursed is everyone hanging by the tree there. And then we remember our buddy Joab, right? The general. David had said, deal gently with my son. But Joab's like, how are we? This is literally the opportunity is hanging before us. So he has guys go out, run him through with 3 spears, and then Joab's armor bearers get around him, strike him, kill him. It's like, all right, war's over. The pretender to the throne is gone. That happens after this. So we have that. So we'll kind of wrap up with that. So that David hears that his son Absalom is dead. He grieves, and he says, "This is in 2 Samuel 18, right at the end there. He says, "Oh, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." This son that did all these things to him, he's grieving his death. The son that was trying to get rid of him. So when we talk about David having a heart after God, this is part of what this is about. That because we have a God who loves, even though his people turn on him and betray him and desert him, God continues to be faithful. So David is trying to do the same thing. Obviously, he made mistakes, and there were problems in his family, but there it is. So David comes back. David, now conflict is done at home, abroad. He pardons his enemies. There is a rebellion that happens that gets put down, and there's David gives thanks to God for delivering him, and then as the time comes for him to the end of his life, he decides that he wants to build this temple for God, because it's not right for God to have be living outside in just this tent, and David has this palace. Nathan's like, okay, do what seems right to you. But then God speaks through Nathan. Nathan goes back to the king, says, no, you don't get to build it, because there was so much warfare, so much violence in David's reign. It's going to be to your son Solomon to build it, to be a king of peace. So David, he doesn't say, okay, that's fine. What does David do? He makes up plans for the temple. He gets resources. He starts acquiring all these things for supplies for the temple to set his son Solomon up in a good place to be able to execute on this. He conducts a census of the people, all these things. And there is the part of the census, there's a reason. So God is not pleased with that part of it, for thinking, well, it's about numbers as opposed to relying on God. So some things happen, but we aren't quite at the end of David's life yet, but everything's in the place now for David's successor, who's going to be his son through Bathsheba, Solomon. So, yeah. Whose half brothers were you saying? Oh, one of the wives. Yeah. So out of the, I don't remember who were children of whom, but out of all the half brothers, I think, yeah, I think she had some of them. I'd have to go back and take a look. Well, yeah. So he had several of the wives. So I think it was Michael, no children to David through Michael, Abigail, Bathsheba, and then Rizal something was one of the concubines. Um, yeah, I'd have to go back and take a look, but it's a mess. Is the short version of it, and we see, as we've gone through the story too, when uh, God's people have done things outside of His design, even if they think, oh, this is a way to accomplish what God has promised, it comes back on them, and not in a good way. Okay, so that's that. Now, just with a couple minutes we have left here, looking ahead, next week is Sunday of the Passion, Palm Sunday. So we're taking a break from the story for a couple of weeks. So we're not our gathering next week will not be on the story. We will not have the following Sunday is Easter Sunday. We're not going to have time for having class Easter Sunday morning, but the following Sunday, April, what is that, 16th or so, which historically is known as Low Sunday, not because of the attendance, though that is a thing, but because to distinguish it from the High Sunday of Easter. So on that Sunday, we will resume with the story. So we'll go into chapter 13 that week, so week after Easter. So just as you're planning your reading and everything like that, maybe some of you have already read through the whole thing. Good for you. But if you want to refresh, you can come back and take a look at that there. So we'll have special study next week, no study Easter Sunday, resuming the story April 16. Cool? All right. Thank you all.